Hi everybody and welcome to this video. My name is Yannis, and in this video I want to walk you through the different settings of the Vermona Perfourmer Mk2 and also through all functions of the knobs. So I just try to explain basically everything that you can do with this instrument to you. I will try to make it short and precise though, because all the exploration should be up to you, because there's just so much to explore, and I just try to show you what you can do so you can then spend all the time exploring this instrument. Nevertheless, it's always possible that there are some open questions, so just be known that there's always this amazing comment section down below where you can just drop any type of question that you may have. Also, as an information, I'm speaking about the version without the CV gate options, so because I don't have this one. And also you're already invited to check out some performances that I made with the Perfourmer, and there's a playlist I'll link on the top of the screen, because the examples in the video are always kind of technical, and if you want to see this instrument actually in real life, you should definitely check some of those videos. Also, be invited to check the timestamps, because if you have some very specific problem, this might help you to find your solution quicker. Before speaking about all the settings and knobs of the Perfourmer, I quickly want to speak about the outputs, because you can see that right now I'm using those individual outputs, because it's possible to send out the sound of all those 4 oscillators through individual outputs, which gives you some advantages if you try to mix it later and want to maybe add some effect to only one track, or just want to have some flexibility later. But there's also some stereo out on the back of the instrument. And you can also use those connectors for some other purposes, because instead of using it as some output, you can also use those tip and ring cables to insert some effects. So you can actually have 4 different effects inserted to all those individual channels. And also, on this upper connector, you can send in some sound, because you can actually send sound through the Perfourmer and modulate it with a filter and some LFO. And also you can send out only the oscillator without any filter or modulation applied through this connector. The nice thing about this thing is that it absolutely doesn't have a lot of settings, but all the ones you have you can see on the right side. And you can use this knob here for different purposes, because if neither of those knobs here is selected, because if they are selected, you see this flashing green light. You can use this for starting some sequence, because each one of those numbers has a sequence, like stored internally on the synthesizer. And if you then click on one channel, it starts this sequence. And right now, it's actually played with all channels, because every channel is on Midi channel 1. And that brings me to the next setting, because if you click on this Midi channel thing, then you can select which synthesizer is receiving Midi on which channel. Because for example, you could also then say the second one receives on channel 2, the third one on channel 3, and the fourth one on channel 4. And if I now start the sequence, it's only being played by the first synthesizer, because those other synthesizers have another Midi channel. And if you click on the Edit button, you can actually check this list here that tells you which number belongs to which setting. Because, for example, number 1 means the pitch bender, and you can enable or disable it for any individual voice. Because right now on my Midi controller, I can use it, but if I deselect it, it's not going to select any information. Also, the same counts for the mod wheel, and I'm going to show you what you can do with it once we reach at the oscillator section in a second. You can also enable aftertouch. It's not enabled right now because I'm not really some aftertouch person, but here you can enable it. You probably need to do some adjustments on your Midi controller or the software, because here you can just switch it on and off, so there's no chance to kind of say how sensitive it is. So those things you need to do with your controller. And the same thing counts for the velocity. So there's just one fixed sensitivity for velocity, but you can do it inside your DAW, for example, or also if your Midi controller has a software where you can just say how sensitive it is to velocity, because again, here you can only switch it on or off. I'm going to speak about autoglide and legato, and also the LFO wave and LFO Midi clock sync once I arrive at the synthesizer section, because then I can show you practically what it actually does and affect. But there's one more thing that you can do, because it has some internal Midi clock. So for example, you can switch on the internal Midi clock, and it's going to count for any synthesizer, because it can't have different tempos for different synthesizers. That would be kind of crazy. So right now it's not receiving the Midi clock from your sequencer or DAW, but taking the internal clock. And on setting number 10, you can actually tap the tempo. By the way, if you're wondering how you connect the Performer to some DAW, for example Ableton Live, I made a video about it in the past that I tried to link here, where I just explain everything that you need to know in order to set up some proper MIDI connection. Underneath we have the play modes, which are really fun because you have 6 different play modes, and you have like M1, which means like if one channel gets triggered, it plays all synthesizers at the same time this channel gets triggered. So for example, if now we have MIDI channel on all of those voices, it just plays all of them at the same time. But if it's on M2, it does something differently. So it plays the voices right after each other, which can create some super interesting effects. The D modes are also interesting because now the synthesizer is only using MIDI channel 1 and splitting the signal into sets of 2. So those 2 synthesizers are one part and those 2 synthesizers are one part. So if I press a note, it changes between those 2 sets. But I can't play 2 notes at the same time. So it's like a, how to say, monophonic duo type sound, if that makes any sense. But the difference is that on the D2 you can actually play both at the same time. So you have polyphony. And those can be very fun as well. For example, if you compose some melody and just feel like trying out some stuff, it's just fun to change the play mode and see what happens without having any expectation. And then you also have the P modes, and here you can basically play chords. So if I, for example, play some chord or chords, you can have like a 4-voice polyphony if you have all of them on the same MIDI channel, because that's again important. And the only difference between P1 and P2 is that, for example, here when I play a chord and play something on top, it jumps back because it stores the note it was actually playing before. And on P2 this doesn't happen, so it just keeps changing the overall. I think it just takes the empty slot that it now takes from one of those 4 voices, but you never really know which one is going to replace first unless you really make sure to know which one you pressed first. But now I thought I pressed the lowest one first, but still it didn't get replaced immediately. So yeah, this mode is also for you if you really like to explore. It's not always completely logical to me, but I hope I could explain it properly. I'm going to switch back to M1 because now we can finally look at the sound engine. And it's divided into 3 different parts because we have like the oscillator section where we just generate the type of tone and the basic sound. Then it's going to be sent through some filter, and then it's going to be sent to some VCA. So we have like 3 different parts. And there's also some envelope generator that you can apply to all of those 3 parts, and also some LFO that you can apply to the VCO and the VCF. And you already know what you do with those white buttons. Here is one additional switch where you can just get some tuning tone for 140 Hz, but I always do it inside my DAW, and also I think it's sent out through the stereo out, so if I do it here, I don't hear it. You don't hear it neither. And the trig lock just gives you some security that you can't touch those. So if you feel like there's some risk that you touch those and maybe do something that destroys your performance, you can just switch it this way, and then it makes sure that those things don't react. So now I'm sending MIDI on MIDI channel 1 to the first synthesizer, and I'm going to use this one to demonstrate all the settings, but they are always the same for all of those 4 synthesizers. There are a couple of additions though, because you see that those things have a knob here, they have this knob, and also here on the LFO button they have some additional option, but I'm of course going to explain them to you after looking at all the basic settings of one synthesizer. So some of those things might be very self-explanatory. So there's a sine wave, a triangle wave, some square wave, a sawtooth wave. You have noise, and also the function for inserting some external sound, because if you plug in a cable here and send some sound, for example, from a DAW into the synthesizer, you can then use the filter section and those modulation things, so actually everything except from the VCO, in order to modulate the sound. It's a bit difficult to put this into practice right now because I never used this setting and it would be a bit complicated to set it up inside my little space here. But there's just one thing you should watch out once you try, because this switch on the VCA section is really important, because it determines whether your oscillator is always on, which means that it lets sound through all the time. Then you also have like the gate function, which means it still doesn't use the envelope, but just some predefined gate inside the synthesizer that just opens once you press a key. And the EG means that it opens when you press a key using this envelope that you generate here. And so if it's not on, you'll only hear your sound once you press a key. And I was very confused by this when I tried this once, but if you wonder why there's no music, this is where you should check. Let's just go to some simple sawtooth wave for the further demonstrations. Here you can just change the octave and you have like 4 different octaves, which is very cool because if you're performing with like independent sequences on those 4 separate channels, you can easily change the sound of some arrangement by changing the octave. And if you watch some of my videos, you will see that I do this all the time. It also gives you some high-pitched frequency and some more lower-pitched frequency, but it's predefined. So no matter where I press, it's the same frequency. And for a single oscillator, it might not be the most useful thing, unless maybe for drum sounds, but also there you can just figure out the pitch with those regular pitches. But you will later see that with those buttons you can do some FM modulation between the oscillators, and there it becomes really interesting because it basically gives you some additional LFO. And here you can just change the tone of the frequency with the tune knob. And otherwise, if you have some pitched sounds, you can just tune it with this knob as well. And I'm just going to quickly do it because I now changed it. Then you have the glide, which is kind of interesting because it makes sure that you don't have the pitch immediately, that it always kind of slides to the next note you press. Let's open the decay a little. And you see, if you open that up too much, you might not even reach your next note because it takes so long. But it's some cool thing, and especially here, like halfway. You can do some very tasteful things with it. Let's turn it back for now. Then here you can say how much of this envelope that you have here gets applied to the pitch. And if it's in the middle, nothing is going to get applied. So if you turn it to the right side, it's going to approach the pitch from some higher pitch. And if you do this with a very snappy envelope, you get those drum type sounds. Although here you should change to EG as well, because this gate doesn't sound too punchy. And if you do it the other way around, it's going to approach the note from some lower pitched tone. It's basically how it works. And here you can apply some modulation to the frequency by the LFO, because you have the LFO here and you can change between 3 different waveforms, although I'm going to tell you more about it in a second. And let's just pick some simple sine wave for now. Here you change the tempo, and if you turn this knob to the left side, the LFO just modulates the pitch. And I'm gonna use some sustain so the note remains. And at some faster tempos, you get some quite interesting distorted sounds. Kind of cool, kind of fun to play with. And if you turn it to the right side, it doesn't affect the sound unless you're using the square wave, because here it applies some pulse width modulation to the sound. Which is kind of cool. And with this knob you change the intensity, while if you have a mod wheel on your Midi keyboard, you can also change the actual pulse width. And this is what you do here with the setting number 2, because you see that it's enabled for all the channels, and if this would be disabled, the mod wheel wouldn't react. But if it's enabled, as soon as you use the square wave, you can change the pulse width with the mod wheel, which is kind of cool. Next is the filter section, and the cutoff basically determines your brightness or your amount of muffledness of the sound, because if it's really low, you don't have any overtones and it's just it's not cutting through so much, but the more you open it, the more kind of overtones and the more sound you get. And with the intensity, it's like this knob, because here you can say how much of this envelope gets applied to the filter, so you can add some more movement to it. So for example, if let's say it's off and we have some rather short sound, you can really add a lot of character because you bring in the filter and there's just more sound. And you can just fine-tune between those two knobs, because sometimes you want less intensity but open it more here. It's usually a little smoother and takes longer until you really get some sound out of the cutoff. But sometimes you also want to increase the intensity here and bring the cutoff down a lot, because it's really quickly going to apply a lot of the filter envelope. And it really gives you those snappy sounds with this type of short envelope. And you can also reverse the direction of the intensity of this filter. You basically get this type of side chaining effect, for example, with this type of sound. And let's bring it back here. There's also the resonance, which can give you, if you increase it a lot, those kind of robotic sounds. But you can also just use a little bit of it. Also, sometimes it helps you to reduce a little the bass amount, to just dial in the resonance knob a little bit. And you can also apply some of the LFO modulation to the filter frequency and get this type of tremolo sound. And what's also important is this knob here, because there you can enable or disable the keyboard tracking. And if it's at 0, it means that doesn't matter where you play on the keyboard. Let's turn off the LFO again. It's always the same reaction, but if you have it on 50, for example, the lower notes will have less of the envelope applied to the filter than the higher notes. And it gets even stronger if you turn it to 100. Just as some drastic example, but it means that you can get some natural flow wherever you play, and also if you play both bass notes and melody notes with the same type of sound, it helps to just make it sound a little less dull and a little more dynamic. And I usually like to have it on 50, so I really encourage you also to have this enabled at least at 50 to have some dynamics. And speaking about the LFO, you can change between just the sawtooth wave, the sine wave, and also some sample and hold. And sample and hold is very fun, because you can either, if you apply it to the oscillator, get some random melodies. And if you apply it to the filter frequency, you get some kind of improvised rhythms, which can be super cool. I like this a lot. And of course, you could also apply this then to the pulse width modulation if you're using a square wave, which also creates super fun results. But yeah, I'm generally a huge sample and hold fan. And you can also change this first LFO setting from sawtooth to square wave if you just go to the menu, and you have it here under number 7. So you could change it here, and then you would have the square wave instead of the sawtooth wave. And on number 8, you can also sync your LFO to the clock from your sequencer or your DAW by just being in the edit menu and on number 8, and then you enable it here, for example. And then those increments, those 8 increments, just are different subdivisions. And yeah, you have to check with your tempo what happens, but usually it's like quarter notes, like quarter triplets, 8 notes, 8-note triplets, and 16th notes, 16th note triplets, and so on. And here you have also the pan button, but it's only relevant if you're using the stereo out, because if you're sending them out individually, the pan button is kind of irrelevant, because then I'm also just going to pan things if I want to pan things inside my DAW. And I think the envelope generator is kind of clear. You have the attack, the initial type of thing, then the decay, how long the sound goes down to reach the level of the sustain, and to then also have some release or not once you leave the key. But if you don't know about some envelopes, you should maybe also watch some tutorial about general synthesis, because I'm not going to go into depth here right now, because I want to show you some additional functions, how you can actually get some interaction between those different voices. So now I'm going to also put the second synthesizer on MIDI channel 1. So I have now this sound with those two synthesizers, because I want to show you how they can interact. There are different possibilities. For example, here you can sync this synthesizer to the synthesizer above, in this case this synthesizer. So you have some oscillator sync, so you can't play out of tune. And you can only use like the tuning button to get some different types of overtones, but you can't just detune anymore, because now they are perfectly synced. And if you go to the other side, you can also sync the LFO. So now this LFO is receiving the tempo from this LFO. But you can see that this one only says speed and this one says phase and speed, which means that if this LFO is synced via this thing to this LFO, and those things always sync to the oscillator above. So if you do this one, the LFO is synced with this LFO, or if you do oscillator sync here, the oscillator is synced with this oscillator. You can change the phase, because if you're totally on the left side, it's on 0. You see they just flash in the same tempo, but here they are kind of out of sync all of a sudden. So if I play now, they are perfectly in sync, but if I now change this to 180 degrees, they are perfectly out of sync. Which is very fun, so you can create some rhythmic effects, and if I go in the parts in between, you can get some more messy rhythms. But also some little delays, because they are just slightly out of sync, and so that's also a very fun feature. And then there's also the FM modulation knob, which is super fun, and again it applies to the oscillator above. So if you do something here, it gets modulated by the oscillator above. If you do it here, it's going to be modulated by this oscillator, and so on. And you can actually just mute the first one, so now this one is only going to be some modulation oscillator. And let's turn off the LFO again. This is our sound, and if I turn this knob, for example, to the left side, the frequency gets modulated by the first oscillator. And you can see if I make changes here, it changes the timbre of the second oscillator. So here you can really explore like crazy what happens if you do stuff here. And so you can also play with the envelope. So if you want to have a sustained sound here, but for example, only want to distort a little in the beginning, you can do it. And it gives you so many possibilities. So if you make some slower attack, you can just really design nice sounds this way. And so in this direction you modulate the oscillator, and in the other direction you modulate the filter. So you have the same pitch still, because if you do the oscillator modulation, you have to check for the tuning, because it's going to be out of tune for sure. But here you stay with your tuning and you just add this kind of little filter distortion, which is kind of cool. And here you can also try working with those high and low type waveforms, because if we make this continuously, or we can also just open it all the time, then we basically have some ongoing LFO. You can see that here the sound also changes depending on the sound of this, let's call it LFO. So you can apply some type of modulation through FM modulation and then use the LFO here for something else. So there are really lots of possibilities. And you could even only use the sound of the fourth oscillator, but before modulate it with all those three. So this one modulates this one modulates this one, and this one modulates this one, but you only hear this one. And you can really make some crazy sounds. And that's what I mean with you have to do the exploration for yourself, because this is really some instrument for just being explored. And if you're in oscillator sync, if you turn it to the left side, of course, you don't get the detune, but just some other change in the timbre as well. Super cool distorted sounds. So yeah, just super fun, and this thing just sounds so huge. And that should be it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. Again, if you have any additional questions, don't hesitate to drop them in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I'd be super thankful if you could quickly take 1 second to click the like button. And as I mentioned, you're warmly invited to subscribe to the channel as well, because I regularly post content about the Vermona Perfourmer. For example, this video that you can just click on right away here. Apart from that, I wish you inspiration with whatever it is that you create, and really hope to see you soon again at this channel. Bye!